We wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about software licensing. This is a topic that's people tend to be sort of weakly aware of, but it doesn't come to the forefront in many cases. To be perfectly frank, this is the first time in several years that we've put it into one of our tutorials, just because we often think that there are other things that we need to spend more time in. But this is a group where, from prior experience, a lot of you we know are already involved pretty deeply in many cases into some fairly large existing projects, and we thought it'd be useful to talk a little bit about licensing and get you thinking more about that. So to start with the bottom line, this is what I want to talk about today should be viewed as information, as a tool to help you think about what you want to accomplish with your software licensing. There's no universal right answer. It's your decision, or maybe your institution's decision, or maybe your boss's decision. But this might give you some tools to have those discussions in a useful way, to influence those things and what have you. So we're going to set up some common terminology and provide some examples of things that you might think about when you're wanting to choose a license. And I said the intent is to get you thinking, not to give you pat answers. And finally, I am in no way a lawyer. Your institution probably has lawyers that actually think about, know about intellectual property law and think about these things, and you should consult with those folks. Or even if you're in a company of your own or something like that, consult with an IP lawyer before you make consequential decisions. So let's start with some terminology and background. So there's various kinds of intellectual property, copyrights, patents, trademarks, and then I'll talk about licenses. So copyright grants the creator of an original work exclusive rights for the use and distribution of that work, including limits on what we call derivative works, and we'll talk about what that means in a bit. Patents grant the inventor of something new, useful, and non-obvious the rights to its production, use, and distribution. So you can copyright, originated typically with written works, books, and things like that, and we apply it typically to software. We also, these days, often apply patents to software, but it's a different concern, and patents will come into this discussion, but most of the discussion has more to do with copyright. And then a trademark is some kind of design or expression or term which identifies a product. And so software may be associated with trademarks and things like that. And licenses are a tool to transfer selected rights in a work or invention or mark, any of these things, from one party to another. So software licenses are mostly about copyright, as I said, but they can have terms that relate to patents or trademarks as well. And another thing to be aware of is your software starts out copyright. The current law is that anything you write, including software, is under copyright on creation. It used to be that you had to file, back before like 1986, you used to actually have to file for copyright with the Library of Congress. You don't have to do that anymore. Anything you write, it's copywritten, okay? Unless you specify some license by which you want to make that available, it's effectively what we call all rights reserved. You might have seen that terminology in places. So you may or may not be the owner. Somebody owns the copyright in this thing you've written, and you're not giving anybody rights to it. That copyright owner may be you, or in many cases, it may be your employer. If you do work for hire, if this is part of your job, it's probably owned by your employer, and you might want to look at your employment contract. It's probably in there. So the first question, the first piece of homework from this module is to find out who owns the rights in the work that you create. So that's, I think, something to be really important, is really important to be aware of. If your employer owns the copyright, you probably have to go through your employer and their legal department to get formal permission to license and distribute the software. There is an exception to all this. In the United States, works created by the US government cannot be copyrighted. They're considered to be in the public domain. And this was originally designed to ensure public access to the US legal code. So you couldn't write the laws and copyright them and then hold the rights back and make them inaccessible to the people who were subject to those laws. But the net effect these days is you will find things produced by the government that are in the public domain. Now, the national labs are not the federal government. They're run by management contractors. And so it's the contractors for the labs that own the IP that's produced. So now I want to talk about sort of the spectrum of licensing. And you've probably heard a lot of these terms. And we'll see how familiar these things are to you. So there's kind of at a high level, two basic ideas. You can have proprietary or closed licenses, and then you can have what are called free or open licenses. So we talk about free software or open source software. And within that, we'll get to in a minute, there's a couple of subdivisions within the free or open area, which is, I use the terms copyleft and permissive. And if you get all the way to the far end, you get to essentially what public domain is, which means that it's a free-for-all. Nobody has copyright in it. So do we use the term free versus open? So free, as in licensing discussions, I think should strictly refer to the freedom to do certain things with the software. Unfortunately, it often gets conflated with free beer, free as in beer, and it muddles the discussion, which is why I tend to use the term open source rather than free software. There's a couple of major names in thinking about this space or advocating for this space. One is the Free Software Foundation, which is, you may recognize as where the GNU products come from and a bunch of other things. And then there's the Open Source Initiative, OSI, which is an organization that advocates for open source software, and they bless licenses as being open source by their criteria, which we'll talk about in a minute. It is a common misconception that if you have something under a free or open license that you are not allowed to make money from it. That's just wrong. We'll talk more a little bit later about some of the ways you can make money with open source software and what that really means. So how do we define free or open software? So the Free Software Foundation has what they call the 4 freedoms. And I use this not because I necessarily think this is the best definition, but it fits on a slide and it's pretty easy to explain. So the first freedom is the freedom to run the program for any purpose. You can't constrain how the software is being used by the user. The second one is the freedom to study how the program works and to change it so it does what you want, which requires, obviously, access to the source code to make this work. The third freedom is the freedom to redistribute copies so you can help your neighbor. And that includes the fourth freedom, the freedom to distribute copies that you've modified to work the way you want. And so the Open Source Initiative has a definition which amounts to the same thing for most purposes. There are some fine points that people can argue about, but this is a fairly succinct way to think about what constitutes open software. And then within the finer distinctions, you have permissive and copyleft. And so permissive licenses basically say that that derivative works can be have a lot of openness to how they're dealt with. They can be relicensed, and so released under a different license, including proprietary licenses. So it gives somebody who wants to make a derivative work a lot of freedom in terms of what they do with this. Names that you may recognize that are considered permissive include the Apache license, MIT, BSD. On the copyleft side, they say that the licensee must distribute derivative works as open source. So a permissive license doesn't say that. It just says, here's the stuff, do with it what you want. That could include relicensing and making it proprietary, for example. Copyleft, on the other hand, they're also referred to as restrictive or sometimes viral because you can see if you do something to make a derivative and you release that, it has to be open source. And if somebody else takes that and makes a derivative, that has to be open source. So it kind of infects, in maybe a positive way, in the people who designed this license, in their opinion, infects follow-on derivatives. And examples are the GNU public license and the LGPL, which is the library or lesser or whatever GPL. Now, something else to note with this is this only applies to derivative works that are released, okay? You can make a derivative work and never expose it to the public, and these licenses can't do anything about that. So what is a derivative work? It's an expressive creation that includes major copy-protected elements of a previously created first work. So you take a piece of software and you modify it, especially in some non-trivial way, and that's a derivative work. Okay? You've derived it from this original piece of software. But what if you just take this software and another piece of software and you compile them and link them together? So here you start to get into more challenges about how you define it. So does it matter if you link these things together statically versus dynamically, or if one piece of code is piping its output to another using Unix pipes, or if these things are going into some kind of coupled multiphysics simulation? So opinions about this differ. The Free Software Foundation, the folks who promulgate the more copyleft licenses, considers everything in a single executable to be a derived work. So everything you link together, regardless of the original source, they consider that to be a derived work, which they would require you to release as open source under the GPL. The LGPL was created particularly to exclude libraries from this. So it says you can link this library with other libraries, and that doesn't constitute a derived work. This doesn't matter as much for permissive licenses, obviously, because they don't infect the derivative works. So you have more freedom with the derivative works. And this leads to concerns over compatibility of combining software under different licenses, which we'll get to a little bit later. So there are a lot of opinions, and this may seem like a fine point, but it's a challenging point in many cases. And to my knowledge, there's really no settled law on this. There is not case law that supports one reading or another for this. So I want to do a little test here. Here are some clauses in a license. I've obscured some things so you don't necessarily know who is the perpetrator of this license. But give these things a quick read, and let's talk, especially focusing on the first two and the darker areas, and give it a read, and let's talk about whether this is an open source license by the criteria we've been discussing. So I'll give you a second here. All right, how many people think this is an open source license? How many people think it's not? How many people haven't had enough time to read it or don't care? Okay, fair enough. This is not an open source license because a couple of things here. First of all, you're only allowed to use the source as is without modification. Right? You can request changes, or you can contribute modifications back with approval of the original authors. But that is one of the FSF criteria that it violates. And then if you make this available to other users, you have to ensure that this user agreement is followed by all the other parties. So it's viral in a sense that this constraint, you have to use it exactly as is. If you were to provide it by anybody else, you have to make sure that they use it exactly as is. So this says you can't distribute copies of your modified code to anybody else. Why would they want to do this? Well, we can try to imagine some of their thinking. Maybe they wanted to impose some measure of quality control over modifications to the code. Maybe they've had problems in the past with users distributing modified code that had errors in it and started giving a bad name to the original code. But there are other ways to deal with this. So some open source licenses include a requirement that derivatives have to be clearly distinguished from the original work. So you can't apply, if your code is XYZZY, you can't say that the derivatives of that, you can't call them XYZZY. You have to find another name for them and as a way of distinguishing them. Now you may say, well, that's pretty hard to enforce, but in practice, this is hard to enforce too, okay? Yeah.
So for the naming though, I mean, usually that's covered by trademark.
It can be.
It's actually not, you can be an open source license and you can still have the project enforce the name through trademark because the licenses don't cover it. Apache particularly explicitly doesn't cover trademarks.
Right. That's true, but trademarks require action. So you have to take a trademark out and you have to be able to show that you're enforcing it, right? Otherwise it becomes Kleenex, right? Kleenex is now a generic. It's On the other hand, the state of Ohio and their major university has trademarked "the" in the, in the context of the Ohio State University. Anybody here from OSU? Okay. Yeah. All right. So what do you want to think about choosing a license? So basically, the question here is what rights do you want to retain or what rights do you want to grant to others? So who can use the program? Who can see the source code? Who can modify the source code? Who can redistribute either the original or the modified code? These are some of the basic things. And can the modified code be relicensed? So with each of these questions, these are the basic distinctions you're making, right? A lot of these initial choices, if you want to have all this kind of control over them, then you're probably thinking about a proprietary license. And I'm not here to say proprietary licenses are bad. I think there are a lot of good reasons to promote open software in science. But I know that there are people who either want to be able to sell their code, and proprietary licenses can make that easier, or they just, there are other reasons we'll get to. They may prefer to keep things proprietary. And then, can they modify the code? Can they redistribute the code and things like that? And then when we get to the last one, the question is whether you want a more permissive license or a more restrictive copyleft license. And I mentioned this question of compatibility. So basically, permissive licenses have fewer issues. The Free Software Foundation has some discussions of this. We'll get to a little bit more later on about compatibility. There are often clauses in licenses, which we just discussed, about the labeling of derived works. So particularly that they have to be identified as different than the original. There may be patent clauses. So a couple of common ways to do this are either patent grants for any patents that are covered by the software, or there are also retaliation clauses, which says if you sue me for a patent violation, you don't have a license to use this software anymore, basically. And a really important criteria here is what are the expectations of the community that you want to engage? So if you're in a particular scientific community, there may be, I'll call it conventions, they're probably entirely unspoken, but maybe a lot of people release their software under GPL licenses or under BSD licenses, or maybe it's a community that keeps everything proprietary. And that may influence, because you want to be in that community, that may influence your thinking too. Now, if you're thinking about open source licensing, you could write a new one, but there's a lot already out there. Both the FSF and OSI certify licenses as either free or open source, depending on their language. OSI has more than 80, and it's much more effective to pick one of these that's already been blessed than to try to write your own. And we'll get into a couple of reasons for that in a minute. Here are some popular licenses that are approved as open source by OSI that you may have heard of. So we talked about Apache, BSD, GPL, and LGPL are also open source. They're just copyleft versus permissive, right? That's the distinction there. MIT, Mozilla, Eclipse. We'll talk a little bit more about this license in a few minutes as well. And here are just a couple of characteristics that might influence you. Are they considered to be compatible with GPL licensed software? And do they include a patent grant? So some licenses explicitly include a patent grant, others are silent on the topic. They contain no language about patents. Yes?
What do you mean by a patent grant here?
So in some licenses, there are clauses that basically say patents that are covered by this software that we own are also licensed for use.
Sounds like it. So OSI argues that there's an implicit patent grant in the earlier non-patent granting license, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it's
yeah.
I just decided to start making it explicit because it was a really murky area of licensing.
Yep. And if you're at a DOE lab, DOE has certain criteria about patents that are different from copyrights, and that can be a sticky area. And there are all kinds of things around that. And so I don't think there's anything settled there, but I don't know that Ornell's lawyers would necessarily agree with OSI's lawyers about implicit patent grants, for example.
No, there are many warring factions on this, which is why they decided to make it.
Right, right. So there are a lot of different characteristics embodied in these licenses, and I know that you can't read this, but here, this is a site called Choose a License. It's done by GitHub, so you can go to chooselicense.com, and it'll walk you through a decision tree to help figure out a license for your software. But you can also go into this appendix, and you can see this big table, which I know you can't read here, but you might be able to do it if you get the PDF and zoom in a bit. But here are a bunch of licenses, and here are various features of the licenses. So does it support commercial use, distribution, modification? I can't even read some of this. Liability, trademark, warranty. So this is kind of a scoreboard. What are you looking for in a license? You can see that different licenses have different features, okay? And you can use the decision tree to walk you through this, a particular path, or you can sort of get a scan over what's out there in a sense. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about some more considerations, but let's stop at this point to see if there are any other questions on the basic principles about licensing and some of the terminology.
What happens if I switch license here?
That we'll get to that. Other quick questions? Yes, in the back.
So for the so if you like so you said that some of them cover like software that's been released. So what counts as like releasing software?
So if you make a derivative work and you never let it outside, you never expose it to anybody else, then that's not released. If you just let it within your team and you're not putting it on a public GitHub repo or things like that, that's still probably not released. If you're putting it on a public website or something like that, then that would be, I think, considered released. Yes.
Would taking open source software, modifying it, and using it internally to a company also not count as released if you just publish it?
That's correct. If it doesn't go outside, yeah. All right, so I said before that open source software doesn't prevent you from making money off of things. So let's look at some possible business models. And I've got 3 columns here: a proprietary license, a copyleft license, and a permissive license. And this is just very generally. So can you sell the software? Yes, in all cases. Now, if it's under an open source license, you're also going to have access to the software regardless as a feature of the license. So people may not want to pay money when they could just get it for free, but you could do that. A lot of organizations have some kind of freemium model. They'll use some level of free capability, and then you pay some money and you get higher capability. There are also dual licensing schemes that if you want to use it for open source purposes or non-commercial purposes, you're covered under an open source license, but if you want to use it for commercial purposes, it's under a proprietary license, and you have to contact us to get a license, and you're expected to pay some fees or royalties or something like that. We just had a question about relicensing, so we'll talk more about this, but one of the things you can do in some cases is relicense the software to be proprietary, and then you can sell it or whatever you want. So copyleft prevents that. Permissive licenses allow that. One of the things that's quite common is you sell the convenience. So you're selling packaging, or you're selling the installation media. I can get the CDs. Remember CDs when software used to come on CDs? Or pre-compiled executables. So all the Linux distribution companies are like this. So Red Hat, for example, it's all based on free software, but they're packaging it up, they're providing support, they used to provide CDs, things like that, right? You can sell professional services around the software. So this is consulting, training, technical support, things like that. This is also something that Red Hat or other companies do. You can sell custom development services. So somebody comes to you and says, yeah, that package you've got is really great, but I really wish it did this. And they may be willing to pay for that. You can sell software as a service. So you put something out there in a cloud, which basically takes a piece of software and provides a service with it, and you can charge people to use the service. And you can also sell research capabilities which are based on having this software in some way. Yeah.
For the relicense to proprietary, though, so the no on copyleft is if you own the copyright to the software, you
Yes,
can
that's-
relicense it to anything you want.
That's a
you
good
cannot
point.
revoke the license you have already given for past versions.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this is basically sort of taking something off the shelf. What could I do with it? If you own the copyright, then you're in a bit of a different situation. If you own the copyright, you have control, although there are still constraints, which we'll talk about. All right, so all this is great, but I don't want others to profit from my open source software. So a permissive license, as we've been saying, allows people to take a derivative proprietary. Copyleft will prevent that. But there may be other considerations. What if you do want a commercial entity to use your software? So a lot of us are involved in collaborative research. Oftentimes that involves companies. In a lot of my work in programming environments and things like that, we're working with the HPC vendors, so Cray, HPE, IBM, others. And they have a lot of problems typically with copyleft licenses. The viral nature is of a huge concern to them, and they really don't want to touch it. So if you want commercial entities to be able to work with your code, be willing to work with your code, you're much better off with a permissive license. Okay, and this goes pretty far. Some companies will just say, no, copyleft, I won't touch it. Other companies are big enough that they can basically say, okay, you as one staff member, you work on only copyleft software, you don't talk to anybody else, you're kind of isolated out in your box, and we don't want you to contaminate the rest of the company. and so even in non-commercial environments, you know, there's also compatibility concerns, which I keep saying we'll get to, but we will get to. The software as a service thing. So this is a way, as I said, to put, you know, take some software and put it, say, in a cloud system and provide the resource. So this is, you know, like Amazon S3 or something like that, storage service. And the challenge is a lot of these things have been based on open source software, but somebody else can pick up that software and put it on their cloud service and charge for it. And so this has become complicated. So you're starting to see licenses now that address putting the software out as a service. And that was the last thing a couple slides back was the Affero public license, which is one of these things that addresses what they call network use. It's basically providing software as a service capabilities based on that software. So this is still an evolving area, but it is, you know, there's licenses that are trying to address this, and there are other techniques that people are using to try to address this. I just want to protect my intellectual property. If I make my code available, then others can see it, and they can take these great ideas that are embodied in my code, and they can scoop me with it. Well, obviously, proprietary licenses will allow you to keep the code private, but if you want to use an open source license, note that they do not require you to make derived works public, only that if you make them public, then you have to make the source available. So maybe you don't make them public, or maybe you delay the public release for a while. So you publish some papers about your wonderful idea, and once the papers are out there, then you release the source code or something like that. Or in some cases, there's a fixed time period. You know, there's the original folks get a year to exclusively exploit their innovation, their data that they collected or things like that, and then it goes out into the public. Let's talk about patent clauses again. So software patents can be a serious consideration. There's a lot of philosophical arguments about whether software should be patentable, but in fact, there are loads of software patents these days. And if you're using a piece of software, even if it's open source, that's covered by a patent, and you don't have a license to that patent, you're infringing, whether or not you know that it's covered by a patent or anything else, okay? And so you could be liable potentially for monetary damages, and there are companies that go around collecting patents and trying to sue people. They are often called patent trolls. And this is a business model for some companies, and it sometimes works, although fortunately not so much as they hope. So a lot of licenses are silent on patents, especially some of the older ones. Todd noted that some folks think there's an explicit patent grant there. But as he mentioned, some of the newer licenses do include explicit patent clauses. So usually they're giving a right to use the patented content. Some say that, yes, we're aware of patents. We're not going to be silent on them, but we're not going to do anything. We're not going to grant any patent rights. So the BSD, what's called the 3-clause clear license, not just the plain BSD 3-clause license, is one example of that. And then this retaliation idea is, if you sue me for patent infringement, you can't use this software, which is kind of nah, 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 nah. But there are some licenses that do that as well. Okay, so finally, let's talk a little bit more about license compatibility. So most software is a combined work of some kind. You're working with multiple packages. You're composing them together in different ways. Is the combined software blob that you're dealing with a derived work? Different licenses have different ideas as to what constitutes derived work and how those derivatives may or must be licensed. And there are different interpretations of what's compatible, and there's very little legal precedent here as well. So the most significant concerns tend to be about the distribution of software if you're really sensitive to this, it's even about what you could consider using together. And so here's a picture developed by one person, David Wheeler, which I've just put as an example. So here are all kinds of different licenses. They're categorized as permissive, weakly, or strongly protective, which is, I've been using the term copyleft. And so hopefully you will recognize some of these different licenses, and sometimes even the versioning is important, GPL 2 versus GPL 3 or LGPL 2 or 3, and things like that. And so basically, permissive things are compatible with more things, and as you go towards the right, there's less and less compatibility, basically. I am not an expert in license compatibility. If you want to talk about that, I think I'm going to point to Todd, because I think he's a lot more knowledgeable than I am about it, or he can run away if he wants. And this Affero license is the one that I mentioned, which is, they call it network protective. This is the one of the licenses that applies to software as a service types of situations. All right, so some strategies for reducing concerns about compatibility. One of the first and foremost things is don't distribute other software packages as part of yours, okay? It may be a little less convenient, but let them go to the package's own website and download it and build it separately. Don't try to bundle things together to make it more convenient for your users. And if you need to modify the software, the first thing is to try to upstream the changes, especially if they're generally useful, or consider only shipping packages instead of shipping your modified version of somebody else's package. You should consider the licenses of your immediate software ecosystem. So what dependencies do you have and how are they licensed? What other software is likely to be used with yours? And then think about how your software interacts with the other packages in the ecosystem. So are you linking all these things together? Or are you piping data through a pipeline or different things? And so depending on the licenses, these may or may not constitute derived works. And then consider the licensing practices of your community or your target audience. What's the norm? What's expected? And generally, permissive licenses tend to have fewer compatibility problems. And if all this doesn't give you a path forward, you might want to consider relicensing your software, which we'll talk about in a minute. Todd?
So one thing that comes up a lot, at least that I've seen for HPC, that people get confused about is if you're considering using a GPL license, like LGPL or GPL, consider that with static linking, LGPL basically becomes GPL. Because you are integrating parts of the LGPL product into your code. And so the whole thing is considered derived work. So if under the distributing other software packages as part of yours, it can be particularly hard to comply with that with LGPL and HPC, because it's really only designed for dynamic linking. And that's really technical, but it comes up all the time in this community.
Right, because a lot of supercomputer systems have historically preferred or sometimes only offered static linking and things like that. So, yep, these are the realities that we have to deal with. And, once again, there's really no settled case law on any of this. So it's a lot of discussion among lawyers, which keeps them in business and complicates our lives. But yeah, we do have to deal with it sometimes. So a few other things to think about if you want to have a bias towards open source. If you're going to have proprietary licenses, then you have to keep track of who's licensed everything, who's signed your agreements, and whatever else. Explicit licensing agreements can inhibit the legal use of software, and especially if you're at an institution. You probably have to have the lawyers analyze and sign off on any license agreement. You're not allowed to do it as just a little employee. You Another consideration that I think is important in this community is that you want to support the peer reviewability and reproducibility in science. So having your code out there and available and visible to people is a key part of that. Your sponsor may require that you release or prefer that you release your software as open source. So in DOE, for example, there are a couple of parts. So NNSA, I think, or maybe it's just the ASC program, and OSCAR, the computer science and applied math part, have expressed a preference for open source licensing. The Fusion organization, FES, within DOE has also basically said, do what they said. So those things are real. You may believe that the results of publicly funded research, which is what many of us are doing, should be publicly available. That's different than the peer review and reproducibility considerations, but it's related. Oftentimes people really have a self-interest in building a self-sustaining community around their software. They want other people to use it and get involved, and that is probably going to be more attractive to other people to contribute if it's open source rather than proprietary. All right, let's go back to this real world example. And let's analyze these other clauses that we ignored before, and particularly points 4 and 5. So I'll give you a second to read those. So you may have seen licenses like this. You won't find these in most of the officially approved open source licenses. They tend to be a little bit particular to the science domain, in my experience, and most of those OSI approved licenses didn't originate in the science domain. But what are they trying to do here? So basically, I happen to know some of the history behind this. This first clause was an attempt to address prior experience of users misusing the code and producing publications with erroneous results. So even if they weren't doing modifying the code, if they were just using it, they were using it wrong. And they were getting bad results and saying, I did this with code XYZZY, and the owners of code XYZZY would say, hey, that was dumb, don't do that. But they wouldn't know until it got published, and now they're asking to see papers beforehand. This is a pretty big constraint. I don't know, it creates a burden on the code owners to do this. I don't know how strongly they attempt to enforce this. What happens if they see somebody publishing with the code without talking to them first? But this is just something that exists in the real world. I'm not advocating for this. I'm trying to explain why some things like this exist sometimes.
If you're doing this, you should look inward and consider whether your code is easy enough to use in a proper configuration.
Okay.
Before you go and put it in your license that other people are responsible for that. People just won't use your code.
And these folks, I will say, do other things that make it challenging, more challenging to use the code than if it were open source. And not the least of which is, to get it, you have to sign a license agreement in the first place. So I have to send it to my lawyers to say, okay, yeah, it'll take them 3 or 4 months, and and then the second clause here is they want you to include an acknowledgement of the code by the proper name and appropriate references that they tell you, what they want you to cite. So this is a natural desire for software to be credited in the papers where it's used, and I think I think that's a very desirable thing. It's not just natural, but it's desirable in our community that we should be citing the software we use. We should be both naming it and citing papers where appropriate that represent that software, and that's usually for the authors of the software to define. This does not violate the standard principles of free or open source software. There are some licenses out there that require attribution, but usually only in the source code. They're not saying that you have to, when you publish, that you have to cite or anything like that, because they don't contemplate this community that we're working in. There are some possible alternatives to help promote this. There's kind of a convention around something called a citation file, and there's a structured version of citation.cff that is machine readable, so you can tools can process it more easily. That says these are the authors. This should be considered the authors of the code. This is the citation I'd like you to use. You should also reference these things, and it makes all that stuff clear. It doesn't necessarily have to go in the license. And it's probably about as effective either way, or as enforceable either way. All right, a few related things. Software licenses can be changed. Okay, you may start using one license for your code and later discover unanticipated problems, or your goals may change. So you can change licenses, but it's not necessarily easy. If you own the well, everybody who has a copyright interest in the code, which may be more than one organization. If you have, some code with a dozen contributors from 3 different labs and 2 universities, right? That's 3 different labs, so that's 5 entities that have to sign off on this. And it's not the individuals, it's really their lawyers, right? Because the IP is probably owned by the institution. Every contributor must be contacted and agree to the relicensing. So your lawyers may have different ideas as to what constitutes due diligence to try to contact everybody. But one useful thing to help with this is to make sure you keep good records of the contributors from the start. A version control system is a really good way to do this, but you also need to look and make sure that people are using proper contact. Git asks you for your name and your contact information, and that just gets plugged into everything that you do behind the scenes. You don't even notice that typically after you've configured Git. But as a code owner, you might want to check those things and make sure you're getting, somebody hasn't just put some silly thing in there and make sure it looks right. There are also mechanisms called contributor licenser agreements or contribution transfer agreements that can simplify relicensing, but they have other challenges. I'll talk about those in a second. So here's a license change example. So an organization owns the copyright to some software packages that they've licensed under LGPL. They had authorship agreements at the time that they asserted copyright essentially at the time the contributions were made. There's some third-party source files that are included under other licenses. And many of the packages have received contributions from other authors since the initial copyright assertion. And they wanted to relicense this because they ran up against this thing. They wanted to work with some folks in industry, and they were very wary of this copyleft license, so they wanted to relicense it to BSD. And so somebody went through and they looked at all the contributions and they determined whether they were substantive or just a simple bug fix. And this was a way of sort of triaging how important it was to contact those people as contributors and get their permission. And then they looked at all the third-party software that was included and they judged it whether it had a compatible or incompatible license. And most of these things were eventually relicensed. Some weren't for various reasons. And then to simplify this in the future, they adopted a contributor agreement, which I'll talk about more in a minute. This actually proved challenging to implement in practice, and they end up not really using it so much. They considered building an agreement into the pull request template where basically at the bottom of the pull request you're signing off about this contribution. And it wasn't clear to them or to their lawyers whether that was enforceable, in part because if I'm doing this, what am I asserting, and do I have the rights to assert that, or will O&L say, no, that has to go through our lawyers? And that's hard to do for every pull request. So there are a lot of challenges associated with trying to change the license, but they persevered and they did it. This is a second example. There were 400 plus contributors, and they actually went out and contacted all of them. They had records, except one person had died, and they actually just removed his contribution from the code base as a way of dealing with that. So they had really good records. They could go out and do this, and they were actually successful at it. So this was, you know, a little bit different approach, but the same principles. They had to contact all the authors and get their agreement to relicense it. So there are some other ways of dealing with this. Usually, when you're contributing code to a software package, it's implicitly offered under whatever license the package is under. So if it's BSD, by making a contribution, you're saying, I expect this to be distributed under BSD or under LGPL or whatever it is. You can also create explicit agreements. There's basically two ways to do this. One is a contributor license agreement, which defines the terms between the contributor and the maintainer. So the license for the software defines between the maintainers and the users. This is, as a contributor, I'm making this connection with the maintainers about my contribution. Another approach is, I actually probably should be calling this copyright transfer agreements, but basically you can say, ORNL owns the copyright in this, but they're going to transfer it to you, to Argonne, say, as part of contributing to this package. The lawyers don't really like to do that. They don't like the contributor licenses agreements either. And all these things have to go through the lawyers, so they take time. There is this idea called developer certificate of origin, which is basically this kind of sign-off in the pull request, for example. There's some language around this that's been proposed. And basically, the developer asserts that they have permission to submit the code. It's not a signed legal contract. I actually ran this by my lawyers. We haven't had time to discuss it extensively, but much to my surprise, they thought this would be okay. Okay, I could sign off on a DCO certification, but I couldn't sign a contributor license agreement or transfer the copyright. So you have to talk to your lawyers to see what will work. But basically what these things are trying to do is either make sure that the contributor is aware and explicit about the terms of their contribution, or they're transferring the copyright ownership to the maintainers, essentially. So you have clear title to all the contributions, right? And if you want to go back later on and relicense your code, then you either own the copyright, everybody's transferred it to you, or maybe as part of the CLA, you give the right to relicense the code in the future. Why not? Well, as I said, this has to go through the lawyers. Okay, so anytime you do that, that creates a barrier to entry, and it can slow things down. And I actually know of projects that have literally lost their funding because the lawyers would not agree to sign a contributor license agreement. So some outside project, we were funded to contribute to this project, but our lawyers wouldn't sign the contributor license agreement, so we couldn't contribute to the project, so the sponsor took away the money. And there are viewpoints about this whole thing. There's a lot of, as with much in IP law, there's a lot of viewpoints and a lot of discussion. So if you look in the resources, we've got a variety of point counterpoint types of things about this kind of stuff. So you've chosen a license, and you need to make sure people know what that license is, right? Does you no good if you don't tell people. So you need to assert copyright, and you need to make the license terms explicit. So there's typically a couple ways to do this. Oftentimes you see a file in the repository at the top level, usually called license or copying or something like that. You also oftentimes see in the beginning of code or headers or things like that, a block of comments that include the license text and things like that. So what I have read is people think it's best practice to do both, which may seem a little bit redundant, but it makes it really clear. And that should include both the license and the copyright assertion, because usually the copyright assertion is within the license, but you need to make sure that that is there as well. You should also keep good authorship logs. The version control, as I said, is really the best way to do that, and that is separate from the licensing information. the authorship, you can say institutions will hold copyright typically, but you need to also track the individuals who've contributed for various other reasons. So this advice comes from this link I've got there, and there's also something called the Software Package Data Exchange, which is a set of standards for essentially coding well-known open source licenses so that they can be read by machine, and you can put those kind of things into your documents, into the files, or into the repository. It's also possible to do the equivalent of open source licensing for non-software artifacts. So you may have heard of the Creative Commons. This is basically the equivalent of open source licensing for non-software products. So all this tutorial material, as you see on all of our slides, second slide, is under, where is it? The CC BY SA. So, I'm sorry, just CC BY, the attributes. So we ask people to say, this is where I got this from, but otherwise it's essentially open source. Okay, so this is about the end. There's a couple slides here of additional resources. I'm not going to talk you through all of these, but I will say a couple of things here. So a colleague, Neil Chu Hong, in the UK gives a talk that has effectively the same title, but the content is very different. Well, not very different, but it developed completely independently. He recommends these additional resources. And then our friend Todd over here, who is also very thoughtful about this, has provided a lot of resources, which I've captured here, particularly about license compatibility and relicensing and patents. And I should say, I forgot to say in the very beginning, if you go to the website and find the page for this tutorial, there'll be a resources from presentations section on that page. Those are all the links that you find here. So you could go to that page and find the links and just follow them directly. You don't have to drill in and find the exact presentation and find the right slide and things like that. And so we are at the end of this conversation about licensing. Are there any questions or discussion?
Yeah, I have a question about, so say like someone publishes a paper with describing like an algorithm for doing something, and I re-implement that algorithm, and then I put it in my software. So I guess that would not be a derivative work, right?
So that's correct. If you've implemented it from a description and you haven't looked at the other code, any other implementation of it, then that would not be a derivative work. Now, depending on the complexity, it may or may not look a lot like other implementations, and you might get into arguments about that. So you might want to, if it were something really important, you might want to think about how you could document that this has been done independently and that you're not looking at these other things. But yes, it would be your own work, not a derivative.
So then, like, what if you, like you were saying, like you look at, so they have their own implementation and it's open source and has a license, and you like look at it for some part of the implementation detail. So would that then be considered a derivative work?
I think now you're getting into great territory. This is the kind of thing that really, it's a little bit like copyright suits in the music industry, right? Is this song too much like this other song that's really popular? Maybe I should have said that the other way. Anyway, so how much did it influence you? How important is that? I think these would be, well, I don't know what the jury would say if it came to, actual legal action, but these are the things, is it some trivial thing, or are you taking something substantive out of the other work that you've looked at? And this is some of the reason why companies get worried, why some companies will isolate people who are looking at working with copyleft software away from people, other aspects of software in the company, because they don't want them to be able to look at, say that this infected other things, even by looking at it in some cases, and the transfer through their heads.
I have a question in about life, for example, hypothetical. So in the whole licensing regarding to what he was saying, part of something of copyright is that you need to have it in a fixated medium. In case of software, if I want to prove someone using my software or is using my software, how that works in software, and also about originality, because there are just so many ways to make a diagonalization of a matrix.
Yeah.
And then if this person is outside the US, because copyright laws are not internationals, but they are providing services in the US, can I ask for punishment damages?
Yeah, I think you ought to talk to a lawyer about that. This is, yeah, there are a lot of things in this area that are hard or impossible to really imagine how you could enforce them effectively. It's part of the reason there's very little case law in this space. So yeah, technically maybe, in practice, good luck, I think. Sorry.
Thanks for the talk. I have a quick question about the culture we have of overprotective extreme copyright.
Yeah.
So, and overzealous lawyers as well. I taught high school, and my students were worried that they weren't allowed to use Stack Overflow code in their assignments. I have, in government, I've had really bad experiences with lawyers who have no idea what a pull request is. So we go through this huge process to open source a project, and they think I need to get my director to sign off on a little patch. But the default is just no beyond everything.
Right.
So what are your comments on the culture we have right now, where it's just really not helpful?
We need to keep Todd from starting to rant here.
I can answer your question. Yes.
Yeah, it can be a challenge. If you're lucky, you've got good, knowledgeable lawyers. Maybe they're open to education. Maybe they're not. Yeah, it's a challenge, and it's a social issue, not a technical issue.